rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. All right, second item on the agenda, the consent agenda. Are there any items that members want to remove from the consent agenda? All right, if there's no objections, the consent agenda will be adopted. Stay. Moving ahead to item number 3. I'll just be forward first. Are there any members that would like to speak tonight on non-agenda items? All right, and if there is agenda items, we'll get to that a little bit later. So we'll move forward to item number 4, to receive a report on the use of restorative practices at Montello Elementary School. And before we move ahead, Mr. Webster would like to do the introduction.
Thank you very much. So we've had, well, let me step back. When we polled the board on workshop topics, school discipline, student discipline, and restorative practices were one of the things that was near the top of the list. And we put on the schedule September 24th, and that workshop remains. But as we reflected on this over the summer and had conversations, it seemed like this is really more than a one-meeting topic. And so what we thought, and I greatly appreciate Principal Jim Cliff and those on his staff from Montello that are here tonight, they're going to be talking about restorative practices as it's been implemented over the last few years at Montello Elementary School. This will, I think, be a great introduction and help the board in having an even more thoughtful conversation and questions at that meeting on September 24th. So that's going to continue, but we'll start off with Montello.
I appreciate you having us here tonight, and I'd hoped to maybe do this a little differently, but then I realized because of the technology and the videoing, this is probably how it has to be done. So we'll go with it. Bill did talk to me last week and asked me if I would mind presenting to you folks and to anyone who might come from the public, and I didn't hesitate to jump at the opportunity and say glad to, would be happy to. And then that was really the end of our discussion. So I got home and got back to work the next day and started talking to some folks from my team and realized that I really hadn't thought about or hadn't really talked with Mr. Webster about audience, who the audience would be, and purpose. And so not having spoken to him, obviously I knew that you folks would be my audience, but I wasn't necessarily sure where each of you might be coming from as an audience member. And then I thought about purpose. And when we think about purpose, is it to inform? Is it to inspire? Is it to teach? Is it to persuade? All those things have sort of gone through my head. And so having also not spoken about purpose to Superintendent Webster, we sort of created our own purpose. And I think you know, it may be what you're looking for, it may not be what you're looking for, but I think as we work through what we'd like to share with you tonight, I hope it gets some things going and maybe some conversation going. We're certainly welcoming conversation around the topic of restorative practices and student discipline and student supports and staff supports. And whether we can answer questions tonight or engage in a conversation at a later date, I would certainly invite that. So our purpose tonight is really to tell you our story, and want to be really clear that I don't represent the Lewiston Public Schools as a whole and what might be happening in each building, but we can talk to you about what's happening at Montello. And if you'll be patient with us in order to do that, we need to give you some background. And I promise that we'll give you the background and then we'll get to the restorative component. We hope to elicit a little bit of conversation in the process of doing that. And we'll see how that goes for all of us. A couple of things I want to mention, that the work you're going to hear about is not my work. It's the work of all of the staff at Montello, both present and past staff. And I always say to people, I'm very fortunate to be surrounded both on my administrative team and my school team by just some really smart, really creative thinkers, and people with different opinions and different knowledge bases. And also, I'd be the first to tell you, people who are eager to do something, and other people who might get on after they see some people being eager, and other people who have really tough questions and say, I'm not ready for that yet. And so I think, you know, one thing I would want you to know is we go through a change process. Those are the kinds of things we wrestle with, whether it's eager people from the public and parents or the school board, or resistors in all those levels. And that's just part of a process. And so we embrace that, and it makes us think harder and dig deeper. And so that's what I want to tell you. Oh, and then in preparing for this, Superintendent Webster gave me an update a little last week after I had agreed to do this, and he sent to me a document that I believe, well, he sent me two documents. One is a piece on restorative practices that I know all the board members received as part of their packet, and then I know a member of the public also sent an article to all of you, and I thank you, Superintendent Webster, for sharing that with me. And I will tell you, when I read the title of that article, I thought, oh, is my purpose to have to talk about this? And all I had done was read the title of the article, which was something along the lines of 5 reasons why restorative practices don't work. And I was like, immediately the back of my brain shot into gear, which is not the part of the brain that does its best thinking. And I was like, is this going to change what I need to do, you know, what I want to talk to the board about? But I actually read the article that night, and then I was like, oh, and then I read it the next morning. I was like, that is a great article. And so I hope all of you got a chance to read it, because it's really good and it's right on. All 5 of those points are right on. So hopefully you'll see that in part of our presentation. So our story is basically, well, can you back out of that for a minute so I can, thanks. Just telling you where we were as a staff and as a school historically, where we are now, where we're going, and the role that restorative practices have in that. And I neglected to introduce you to some of the members of my awesome Montello team, but I have Ellen County down here, who is a first grade teacher at Montello, and this will be her 2nd year. So she has a perspective of coming in last year. 3rd year, oh my goodness. Steve Maroon, who is our, his title is Extended Day and Extended Year Supervisor. His title does not describe the work, the full amount of work that he does, but he also oversees and really oversees our entire systems design in terms of how we're responding to students and how we're proactively preparing for them. So he has a role in talking to you a little bit about that systems design tonight. Jamie Roble, who's been on staff for a number of years here, so she's been through some really tough times with us as a staff, and I think some better times. And she's a 6th grade teacher, so you'll get a little perspective of what this looks like for our youngest kids and also for our oldest students at Montello. And then Ruth Joyce, who is our special education supervisor, and then one of our assistant principals, Tiffany Demarest. So Rhonda can't be with us tonight. She's not feeling well, so otherwise she would have been here. So where we were, I just want to talk a little bit about Montello School, and I actually backed up to 7 years ago. So this was even prior to me being principal, but I was an assistant principal at Montello during this time, and we were really struggling as a staff and a school, and we continue to actually, we're just having a lot of difficulty with student behavior and discipline practices. There was a need to make some changes as a school, and oftentimes when there's a need to make a change, my habit is to immediately want to find a solution or find the prescription to resolve something. And even though I've learned over a number of years that sometimes solutions take a lot of thinking and a lot of trial and error and a lot of hypothesizing, our nature, especially when you're feeling like you're in a crisis mode or something is really overwhelming, is like, give me the solution, or somebody please give me the solution. So we knew we were in need of some changes, and one of the things we did as a staff was we adopted a positive behavior interventions and supports model or framework, and provided a high level of support for staff, and that was really important. And in just really briefly, we relied upon some consulting and some coaching. And adopted this model, which you've probably heard of before. Key elements are being safe, respectful, and responsible. And to summarize, it's really about setting expectations for the school, having processes and procedures that are really clear and established, and trying to do things in a positive way. Tends to be pretty systematic, plays a very important role in what we do at Montello School, and led to some, I think, some positive changes. But I'll tell you what it didn't lead to in a few minutes. But it wasn't enough. And so despite having a number of positive things in place and reward systems and so forth, that wasn't meeting the needs for all of our students. And so we continue to have a lot of what we call office discipline referrals. So teachers who or staff who refer students to the school administration for disciplinary purposes. And we're pretty limited in sort of how we respond when we receive a discipline referral, and it might be a conversation with a student to the most extreme, which would be a suspension from school. And we're trying to really think about why that might be. Why do we get so many referrals? What is it about our students that is why they're having difficulty regulating their emotions? Why are they behaving outwardly in the classroom, causing disruption, and what can we do about that? So we started looking, and this usually comes, I say we because I can't tell you one person's responsible for something, but as a staff or maybe a small group of staff, we start talking and different things start coming up, and we started talking a lot about poverty, and that probably was inspired by a few teachers who perhaps had read a book, and some of us others hear about a book. And in this case, I think when we started talking about poverty, we started looking to Ruby Payne, who talks a lot about generational poverty and so forth, and trying to understand that, and then saying, well, wait, we've got students at Montello whose story is different than this one that Ruby Payne's talking about, and so what else can we learn? So then we looked to Eric Jensen, who talks about poverty from more of a chemical, biological type standpoint, and we started, so we did a book study as a staff, and we talk about, in those book studies, we tried to read the literature, talk about that in our setting, in our classrooms, and then talk about how might we respond differently, based on what we've learned. And so a lot of our talk around poverty was, understanding circumstances, understanding the language we use in front of students, and trying to be more intentional about what kind of language we're using and so forth. And so again, really positive intentions of what we're doing. Put a system in place of PBIS, provide a lot of PD for our staff, and dig a little deeper. And the conversation just continued with staff. And when I say conversation, it wasn't always positive conversation. Our conversations involved tears. Our conversations sometimes involved behind closed doors, lots of frustration. Our conversations sometimes result in teachers who are disenfranchised or feel that the work that and the circumstances with which they're trying to support are so overwhelming that they don't have the capacity to do it. And so, there's a piece about teacher turnover too. And when you're having teacher turnover, that makes things difficult because all your new learning is lost, and then you have new people to bring on board. And sometimes there's great things that happen with that, and other times that can be really difficult. But those are our realities, and so that kind of stuff was happening. So clearly it just wasn't enough. And so in the fall of 2015, that would have been 3 school years ago, for those of you who aren't familiar, Cindy Gish and I were partnered for my first 2 years as the principalship, and then she was transferred to Geiger, or moved to Geiger to take on that principalship. And so that was I had only been principal for 2 years, and I always say to people, I'm pretty new to this, and I'll tell you that tonight. I'm really new to this thing, and so I don't have all the answers. And that was a very difficult transition period for me personally, having to bring in a new administrative team, and it was very difficult for the Montello staff who were much appreciative of what Cindy had to offer them and the kind of support she could provide. And we had a real grieving process. But, you know, with difficult circumstances often comes opportunity. And I think one of the things we do awesome at Montello is we try to think about what's the opportunity. So challenge, what's the opportunity? And that's sort of a mantra that we often take. And we were really fortunate to find some really smart and skilled people to bring on to Montello. So one was Amber Eliason, who's now your principal at McMahon School, and another person we brought on was Kelly Rogers, who had come from the Bath School Department into her first administrative position, which was the special education supervisor at Montello. And so I had new thinking partners. Our staff had a new set of thinking partners, and that just started a new conversation. And the fall of 2015 was truly a boiling point at Montello School. It was, this will be my 12th year at Montello. In my experience here in Lewiston, it was my most difficult personal moments came in the fall of 2015. I think that's probably true for any staff that were at Montello as long as during some of the time I've been there. And it was a time that fall when I actually reached out to Bill early in the fall, and I said, I need help, and I need to have a conversation with you, and I need you to come to Montello School and spend the day with us. And he did. And he spent 2 hours with me in a conversation, and then he spent the remainder of his day in our classrooms. And then probably within a week we were back and he said, what do you need, Jim? And usually my answer isn't I need money and positions, but in this case it was, here's some very specific help I need, Bill. I need another assistant principal, and I need a social worker, and I need another ed tech that you can give me the discretion to use how I need to use them. And so Bill came to the board at the time and shared with them his experiences, and you know, the board was approving of that, and we were really fortunate. And at the same time, Sean, who was the principal at the high school, reached out to me and said he knew from a couple of our management team meetings, or maybe actually just talking to me in person, I'm not sure, that I was in need of some support. And he made the decision to offer up some support during the month of October, and said, I can send my dean of students down to help you out. What do you need? And I said, I would love to take you up on that offer. And so Rhonda Fournier came to Montello that way, of just people, you know, on the administrative team recognizing a need elsewhere and saying, I can make that sacrifice so that we can help you get things going in the right direction. And so at that time, things were really tough. And I think on the day that Bill came to visit Montello, I probably had students falling out of the office. And at those times, again, your brain goes back to this part of its not thinking spot. And you know, you want a quick fix, and you want the prescription, and usually there isn't a quick fix, and there's usually not a prescription. We did a couple quick fixes. One of the things we did was we displaced a couple of staff members, and I took my in-school suspension program and I changed it, and we created a bigger space. And I would tell you two sides to that story. One is, like, we got the kids out of the office, so it didn't look so chaotic, but we had kids out of classrooms and not in the right classroom, and that's not okay. But it at least got things calmed down so we could stand back and think a little bit and try to strategize. And we really, Amber and Kelly and Rhonda and some of our staff really started our strategizing around what can we do immediately and what do we got to do long term, because this is not working for our staff and it's not working for our kids, most importantly. And so we were looking for a discipline fix. We had staff, teachers actually talking. Some of them were members of our leadership team. We're talking about what's this restorative practices thing. I've heard a lot about this. We had Kelly, who had come from Bath, who's constantly grabbing at my arm, say, Jim, you got to listen to me. I did this in Bath, and I've got some ideas. And I wasn't a quick sell, but I had people who had experiences who were persistent. And when you have smart people who are being persistent, it's a good idea to start listening. So that's what I started doing. And we sent some people who had expressed an interest out to a couple conferences to just go to a conference down in Portland and get some information and bring it back. So we had some people on staff now who had some information and others who wanted information, and that's kind of where our process started, specific to restorative practices. At the time, I'm going to have Steve step in here for just a minute. We were really ingrained at Montello in developing a support system, an academic support system for our students, and we call that response to intervention. You hear the words or the letters RTI all the time. I think people think sometimes RTI is a program. It's not. It's a systems design. It's about how do we support our students, how do we monitor what they're doing, and how do we make adjustments to that, depending on how they're doing. And we were deeply ingrained in the academic side of things. We were involving many of our staff in graduate level literacy work, understanding how kids acquire reading and how they acquire writing, and a lot of literature on that. And we were doing a lot of work with academic interventions, and had people screaming in the air like, hey, if we don't get the social, emotional, and the behavior under control, they can't access this stuff anyway. But we had a pretty good thing going with the academics within the capacity of our staffing. So we also realized that we had to develop our behavioral supports more deeply, because if kids are dysregulated and things aren't working for them, then they're not positioned well to be in the classroom anyway, or they're positioned to be in the classroom but not get anything from it. So that's kind of our thinking, and that remains our thinking. And if you spend time at Montello, or you spend time with people who work at Montello, what they'll tell you is we are hyper-focused on meeting the social and emotional needs of students, and it really comes from, if we can get those basic needs first, then the social emotional needs, and then they're positioned to be ready for the academic piece. And so that's kind of, I think, that's not my philosophy, but I think it's a shared belief in philosophy among most of our staff. What's that? Yeah, so one thing that might help in telling the story is I'd like Jamie, who was a classroom teacher while this was going on that I'm telling you, is to tell you a little bit about what that looked like in her classroom. And so I welcome you up to do that.
So this is my 8th year at Montello. I've always been classroom teacher. When I started, I'd already done 1 year in Portland, so I knew a little bit about the population, but not really enough. In my first year, we had just taken on PBIS, so that was really helpful that we were diving right into that. What I found was in the next years to come, I continued to feel I was always on board with PBIS, still am. So I had all of that in place in my classroom. I was constantly, seeking out mentor teachers and trying new tricks and trying to figure out how to, why aren't kids doing what they're supposed to be doing? At the time, I would have said I was already a teacher that was pretty focused on relationships, but I hadn't really been trained in that philosophy. It was just part of my core. What got me was, as we got those things in place, a couple years would go on, and then I was finally in my 3rd or 4th year, and I had many times where I cried and said, I can't do this anymore. I was constantly saying the needs, I can't meet them all, and why isn't it getting easier? I've been here longer, I know the population, and it still wasn't getting easier. So I very much remember the 2015 year of the boiling point when things really got, it seemed like we were putting out fires. They were only the most, the unsafe fires, the bigger, the fighting. I felt constantly like I wasn't able to reach all of the kids. There wasn't a lot of sense of relationships in the classrooms. As much as I tried to instill that, there was still, my students felt very divided. The way I tried all these different tricks with behavior and positive incentives, and I wasn't finding that there was permanent change happening. That maybe they were getting better at walking in the hallways and things like that, but we weren't getting to a place where they could learn yet. They were still very dysregulated, still very hyper-focused on what was going on at home, and the things we were doing wasn't getting there. And in the meantime, our administrators were buried. and the morale at Montello at that time was that we were at a state of crisis, like something's got to happen. Everybody, had all these things that needs to happen right away, and we were just in a bad spot. And I kept thinking, I'm now in my 4th year. Why isn't this easier? So then, we're gonna get to the later part, I guess, later. So I guess I was just feeling like I've been pouring my soul into it. It's still not getting better. I feel like I knew the surface of my students and what was going on. I was, learning about the different cultures and poverty, and but I think Jim said it best. It just wasn't enough. There was this feeling of we're not doing enough. We're not hitting the kids where they need it. We are overwhelmed. Teachers that were veteran teachers that I had looked up to for mentoring were leaving. I thought about leaving many times, but my heart was still in. I like this challenge. I was hopeful we would eventually get there, but daily it was going home thinking, I did not do enough today. Today felt like a zoo. How am I going to have kids learning when it feels unsafe in the classroom? Kids were constantly out of the room, missing things, big chunks of time. They were not coming back in restored. Like, they weren't coming back in with a new understanding, ready to learn. They were just coming in almost ready to start it up again. So it was really hard, and I felt really defeated. I felt like the kids felt us feeling defeated all the time, and so it was just an atmosphere of frustration, and like we were all just running around trying to get through the day without anything unsafe happening. And I really wanted to stay in Lewiston, and really loved the kids, but I was just hitting my head against the wall every day. Like, I'm not doing enough, and I just continued to try to absorb all the resources I could, and it still wasn't feeling great. So definitely it was a boiling point. It was chaotic. We could feel it. I mean, it was really across the school, whether it was duty aides or whether it was janitors or administration. It was just people were feeling like we are at a crisis, and it's either people are going to bail out or we need to do something about it. So yeah, it was hard, but that's why I'm happy to be standing here smiling and coming back.
So, by the way, there were really good things happening at Montello at that time too, and we did have happy times. But I think that's don't try to dramatize things, but it was tough stuff, and you need to know that. So, I wanted to share. I could share data with you all night long, and I'm not going to, but I want to share a couple pieces of data so I can at least give you some context for what Jamie's talking about, what I'm talking about, and so. I'm glad you all brought your electronic devices. I'm going to invite you in to participate in a little bit of conversation with us. So if you wouldn't mind, on your browser, going to
menti.com, so it's MENTI.
hopefully it'll work. Yes. TI. Yeah. And I've got a couple questions that I'd like you to consider. So you're going to log in. You're going to put in 374560. You can do it with a space or no space. It doesn't matter. Try it both ways today. And I just wanted to gain a little perspective about what perspective or perceptions you may have. So at Montello School, before you answer the question, an office discipline referral could originate from a whole bunch of different places. And in fact, they originate from way more places than this. But these are, some pretty popular ones. So we've listed down here playground, hallway, bathroom, classroom, cafeteria, and the school bus. We considered school bus because they are on our school grounds before they leave our school grounds. And the question is, where on school grounds do you think the majority of our discipline referrals originate from? You can go ahead and respond to that. You'll remain anonymous, but it'll be interesting to look at. And then just, okay. It's okay. It's okay. I understand. 2, 4, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. Perfect. Hey, that's good. And would you maybe just take 10 seconds and turn to someone next to you and just briefly give them a quick explanation of why you chose the spot you did? What were you thinking about? So you could turn, just talk to Tina real quick. Or no, pull up. All right. I'm going to show you the data for the last 3 school years of where our discipline data originated from. Some of you might be surprised. So the blue represents the 15-16 school year, the one we were just talking about. The red represents the 16-17 school year, and the green represents the 17-18 school year. The locations are classroom, playground, school bus, hallways, cafeterias, and bathrooms. And those are actually the ones where we have some other locations, but these are the hot spots. And 2 of you won't be surprised, but I guess the rest will, that the majority, and consistently, actually the data goes back further, but I'm only doing 3 years, consistently, our office discipline referrals originate from classrooms. And so we do a lot of thinking about that. We do a lot of thinking about what's going on in our classroom, what tools do our teachers need, what supports do our teachers need to support their students. We talk a lot about what can we do different on our playgrounds. Why are, what's going on out at the playground? And I can tell you some very specific things we've done about the playground. I can tell stories about the buses and what we can do and what we would love to do but can't. I can tell you a little bit about hallways, but right now the most important spot at Montello School is the classroom, and that's evidenced in the data. And it's not, it's stark, and I find it shocking. So, by the way, this wasn't all our discipline referrals for each year. These are just the ones for those locations. But I will point out 1,207 referrals to the office 3 years ago from classroom. There are 700 students at Montello School, and there's 175 school days. That's a lot of kids that missed class time, whether it was 5 minutes down in the office, an hour down in the office, a day not in the classroom, a week at home. Could have been any of those things, depending on what the referral was for, and then how we handled that as an administrative team. So from a discipline standpoint, so things I'm really pleased about is what we've been able to do in the last 3 years in terms of reducing those, and it is not by chance that these things have come down, but it is also not by prescription or an immediate fix. It's because of a lot of thinking, a lot of trial and error, a lot of digging deeper by our staff, and our staff willing to try different things and do different things, and hasn't come without naysayers and frustration among staff or others as well. So it's part of that, again, just part of a change process. So I'd like to, we've got another piece that we think you might find interesting. So on your menti.com, you should be able to get to a second question. And you've seen the data on just the referrals for those 3 years. So the question is, on average, how many times do you think we suspend students in school or out of school during the school year? And I actually gave you a range, so it'll help you a little bit. We gave you a range, but I'm just curious how you think we're using that suspension thing to change behavior. And you can just use the meter to go across where you think that might be. So it's on average, so how many times was a suspension from anywhere from a half day to a 10-day in school or out of school? How many times do you think that disciplinary action was assigned? Okay, so that's not total days of suspension, that's just the number of instances that resulted in some type of suspension from school, either in or out.
What year are we talking?
Well, this says how many times do you think during the school year? So during a school year, how many times do you think we do that? Yeah, so I didn't break it down by year, but I'm glad you're thinking about that. That's a really good question, right? Because you saw that the discipline referrals are changing, so one of the hypotheses might be that maybe our suspension rate is changing too, right? That what we well, you hope so, I hope so too, but we'll find out in a minute. But it's a really good question, right? And when you ask those kinds of questions, when we hypothesize like that, so thank you, Tanya, like, then we're like, okay, let's study that. And that's what we do at Montello. We ask questions and we study it. We don't jump to conclusions, but it's a really good question. So we just asked a broad question. How many times a year do you think Tiffany, Rhonda, or Jim suspend students, either in or out of school? I'm not proud of this, by the way, if that helps you move your meter. Everyone get a chance? Great. So you can, I don't know if you can see the little, well, never mind. That's okay. Y'all are all over the place with that. We've got a peak here around probably, can you get the number two up there to see what that is for number? No, it doesn't. So this is 159 here, 500. So you all think that probably 200, or there's a good chunk of, oh, there's bad math. All right,
200 or less.
that's the 250 mark. You know where you are. I don't know where you are. Okay, so you know where you were. Well, we'll show you the data for the last 3 years. That's okay. We'll get to the right one. Red is an out-of-school suspension, which means a student is not allowed on school property from either a half day up to 10 days. And that's what the law allows, and what your school policy, out-of-school policy allows. Blue is an in-school suspension, and only recently in the last few years have we been able to say, how can we keep kids at school, and how can we make a meaningful experience? And we continue to talk about how can we make it a meaningful experience. But I'm really concerned about these numbers, and I think anyone here ought to be really concerned about the numbers for 15, 16, but we should be concerned about the 16, 17, and we should be concerned about the 17, 18. But 3 years ago, we had suspended 90 students, or 90, might not have been 90 students, it probably wasn't 90 students, because we have some students who received the same consequence multiple times. And I do think that's a piece we'll want to think about, and maybe we can talk a little bit about when we get into the restorative part, because we have, usually, when we have a high number of students in the suspension, or a high number of suspensions, sometimes we have handfuls of students who account for a whole bunch of those. And so when we think about consequence, change in behavior, consequence, change in behavior, it's not always the case. In fact, my experience has been, more often than not, it doesn't change behavior. But I only rely upon the data to say that. It's my intuition and the data, what the data tells me when I look deeper at it. So 90 out-of-school suspensions, 428 in-school suspensions. Going into the 16-17 school year, I would have been thrilled to have a bar as high as the previous year, but less red. I was extra thrilled at the end of the year when we went back and looked at our data to say, and actually we haven't looked at it in here to say, we're making progress. We've got far fewer instances where we are suspending students in or out of school. And I also have tough staff who say things like, well, Jim, you're the one who gets to decide if you suspend a student. So for all we know, you're just choosing not to suspend students. But then I would refer back to the previous slide I showed you, which is the referral to the office begins with the staff member, it doesn't begin with the administrator. And those have come way down. So again, I can hypothesize, and we should, but what that says to me, if there's less referrals, that means something's going better for those students and those staff, because far fewer referrals are coming in. So it shouldn't have been surprised when far fewer referrals came in that the numbers went down. And then this past year, they were brought down even more. And I was really pleased with only 17 instances suspending kids out of school. But I'm really not pleased with it because we're talking about kids that are 5 years old up to 12. And I didn't include this as one of our questions, like which grade level do you think represents most of our discipline data? But maybe you could ask me that in a little bit, and I'd be excited to share it with you. But these numbers are way too high, and I did have someone ask me earlier today, what's your goal, Jim? And the goal is 0. And that should be all. We should share that goal. We should share not there yet, and I think it's going to be a while. And I don't think I'd like to think that we'll keep shrinking this, but maybe it's going to be a little less shrink each year, because I think we're kind of at a point where we've gotten some of our big gains, and now we've got to look a little bit deeper about some circumstances about that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, what we think or what we'd like to hypothesize about, and where we think we're going to need to do some more learning as a staff and as an administrative team. All right, where's that lead us to? Where we are. So for all that speak of things that were going rough, we do some awesome stuff at Montello School, and our systems design in how we approach identifying, recognizing student needs, planning for them is awesome, and it's never good enough. And every year we're revising it, and every year we're getting feedback from our staff, and every year we're trying to do things better for our students. So yeah, let's do that right now. Let's do that, and then we'll have Steve talk. Okay, great. Go ahead. You want me to do that? All right, so this is another one of those turn and talks for all of you. And I'd like you to think of a time that you had to solve a complex problem. And it doesn't matter what the context is. Complex problem, and you weren't sure where to start. It's not an interview. You don't have to share it with me, but I might invite you to share it in a minute, because I do want you to have a voice, and I want you to be part of the conversation. But maybe to warm up, maybe if you feel so inclined and are daring enough or comfortable enough with your own members of your team, maybe you could turn and talk for just a minute about what was, really briefly, what was the complex problem, and what was going through your mind as you were trying to figure out a starting point. So take a couple minutes to do that. I'm sorry. So I'm going to try to do better standing here. Sean just told me that at least one or more people have texted him to tell me to speak into the microphone, so that means people are listening tonight, so that's good to know. And I'll try to do better. It's just not my nature to stand at the podium and talk, so I'll try. But either all of you each had something complex that you've tried to wrestle with before, or you're like really good at fooling me. So I'd just be curious if any of you would be willing to share just really briefly what your complex problem was and what was going through your head as you tried to think of a starting point for tackling it.
So when I became a school committee member, poverty I felt was our single biggest issue. So I decided to try to take that on. It's been very challenging to do that. It's just a much more bigger, complex issue that I've ever faced, and slow to start, still struggling with how to make something work. But.
Thanks for sharing that. All right. Well, this is kind of where we're at. We get presented on a daily basis at Montello with complex problems, and we're always looking for a starting point. So I'd like Steve Maroon to talk to you for just a couple minutes about our systems design. And I think this is really important. We're billed as coming here to talk to you about restorative practices. I don't think you can understand what we're doing with restorative practices without understanding the full context of where it fits in the broader picture of what we're doing at Montello. So I appreciate your patience and we really can't do justice to our design in a quick conversation, but I want to give you, Steve wants to provide some real points for you, and then I will extend the invitation to you to come over to Montello when the school year started and spend some time with either me or Steve or any of our administrators. And Wednesdays would be a really good day because you can see some of our more formal problem solving structure going on. But we'll talk to you a little bit about it.
Hi, good evening. So our RTI system has evolved over the last 5 or 6 years, probably a little bit longer than that. We really try to be as proactive as we possibly can. And so part of our design is prior to the school year starting, we have all of our social emotional supports in place. So children who were identified last year as needing to be on some sort of a behavior plan in order to be successful in the classroom, they have those plans ready for day one. We also look at a combination of social emotional data as well as teacher anecdotal data, and we look at the historical trend for those children and the children who have either gotten worse or have not improving. They'll be prioritized towards the top to put in skills groups or look at individual counseling. So we try to have all of our social emotional supports in place day one when children arrive. And then we'll typically wait maybe a month or a month and a half for the teachers to get to know the children, and then we'll start putting our academic interventions in place both during the school day and through our after school program. And then in October, we do a whole class review twice a year. October is the first one, and the second one is in the spring, and we'll meet with every single teacher, and we'll talk about every single child, and we'll look at their academic data and their social emotional data, and we'll make sure that if there's something that they need, that we're trying to make sure that we have something for that child, whether it's the food pantry, a skills group, academic intervention or whatnot. And then also during the school year, teachers can reach out for support whenever they need help. So if they struggle with a student and they're not really sure where to turn, and they may or may not have tried anything, they may not know what to try, they can just simply turn to the student support team, which is part of RTI, and they'll just tell us as specifically as they can what the problem is. And then we have a system set up where there's protocols, there's lots of data being collected through PowerSchool, through data that's not collected through PowerSchool. We'll reach out to the parents, we'll reach out to the children, we'll go back to the teacher, and we'll collect all of this data. And then we have protocols in place through student support team meetings to try to really problem solve with that teacher and try to put some supports in place for that child and help that teacher. And we always follow up every 30 to 45 days just to kind of see how things are going and see where we need to make some changes. But I'm more than happy at any time to talk more about RTI in the future. Thank you.
So, hi, I'm Tiffany. Where we're going, this has a lot to do between, like, RTI and restorative practices are really integrated, and this is why. If you click the next one, I know, hard to see.
This isn't one of my skill sets.
All right. So we at Montello take a process that we think is really dynamic. Like Jim mentioned before, we try not to do these like quick fix solutions. We've just found it doesn't work. And it really just makes everybody really dissatisfied and frustrated. And so when we approach a problem, a complex problem, we really are data driven. So that usually leads us to a question, something we're curious about. With RTI, we had initial issues with kids just not performing academically. And then it became behaviorally, we don't have supports because, or that maybe that's what's missing because the data is showing that kids are getting referred quite a bit. So at Montello, we do often get curious, and that leads us to a hypothesis. We don't know what the answer is, but we can ask some good questions and try to figure it out, which then leads us to an action. So in RTI,
we realized, okay, we don't have a real systems design for getting kids the support they need. So Steve developed a really amazing process for really following up with teachers to see if they're getting the supports they need, following up to see if students are successful, if the interventions we put them in are working. And then we reflect. We analyze our data over and over again. We reflect on if it's working and make adjustments when it's not. So if you want to go to the next slide. So restorative practices came about because teachers, administrators were wondering, like, what is it about our students that in our school, kids are not being successful. They're out of the classroom more often than they're in it. And so teachers were wondering about restorative practices, and we decided to look into it, and we didn't know if this was going to be a quick fix solution, if this was going to be a process, but we wanted to really look at it. Well, we looked at our data, and we were curious, what can we do differently? So restorative practices was an approach we took, and it's really founded on these 4 concepts on the side, so you don't have to click anything, but it's really about relationships. So our relationships with each other as staff members, our relationships with students, our relationships with parents, and the dynamics that go into that are really complex. So when you're not coming from the same understandings or the same backgrounds, there's a lot of room for misinterpretation, a lot of room for difficulties. So I mean, we all have different levels of relationships in our lives. So personal relationships are complex as well. Nobody has that piece figured out in life, I don't think. If you do, let me know. So that's definitely one of the things we were wondering about. What are there dynamics at play that we maybe need to think more intentionally about? Same with community. Do we have a strong vision? Are we all working under the same sort of understandings about how a community should operate? Do we take time to listen to one another? Does everybody have voice? Or the people, the stakeholders, everybody from parents to students to community members, do we all share equal voice in a process? And then thoughtful discipline. So it's really easy to, in a moment of crisis like 2015, to say, okay, in-school suspension, like you are in crisis mode, you're just trying to fix it. But when you're thoughtful about how you approach a situation and really are thinking about all of the complex factors, you can really change behavior. And I think that was our goal. It's like we didn't want just to sit here and, suspend students because that's the biggest consequence we can give as administrators, and then have the same problem again and again and again. When we look at our data, actually we see a lot of the students are repeat offenders, or they come to the office multiple times and behavior doesn't change. So we wanted to see if restorative practices could bring a new approach to that, and maybe we can get to the heart of what's going on, and that will lead to the change in behavior. So Ellen, if you wanted to talk a little bit. Ellen has been here a few years, so she is a newer staff member. She has a different perspective than Jamie does, because she is a newer staff member, but also because she teaches in the lower grades. She'll speak a little bit to relationship, community, and voice.
So part of being new is I didn't have any of the background. I came in new with and dumb because I'm learning a whole lot right now about what it looked like at Montello. So I came in somewhat fresh because I started teaching 25 years ago, taught for 9 years, stopped for 20, and did some other things in between. Raised 6 kids that came from hard places, very hard places. Got a background in trauma from that. Went on, did some preschool teaching, special needs preschool, and then did some children's mental health case management. So I came to Montello with a background that was kind of rich in meeting the population that I was meeting. And I had just finished a master's in trauma and crisis counseling and had to decide, what am I going to go do with this degree? And I ended up going back to teaching, which I said I never would. But I've done more with this degree here. And I wanted to know where could I impact the most change. And so when restorative practices was mentioned, it was familiar to me, and I was like a Tigger. I was like, oh, this is great. I'm in the school that's doing this. And I wasn't exhausted from the years of being in a boiling pot. And so I was Tigger, jumping all over the place, really happy, talking about it all the time. And then I started to notice, okay, I feel a little awkward. Not everybody's jumping around. Not everybody's really happy about this. And then I started to, Ryan, what's Ryan's last name? Ryan Anderson, our coach she uses a term called listen with curiosity. So then I started to listen with curiosity and think, why isn't everybody else jumping up and down? This is going to be great. And that's when I started to hear people were at different places. People's energy was in different places. And so that it took some being really respectful and looking at how are we going to meet everybody where they're at and move forward. So that's been kind of part of the challenge, to see how do we move this forward and have everybody in different places. And it's still to be found out. We're still doing it. It's a work. It's a practice. And that's why, when you talk about restorative practice, it's not a program. It's not something we're going to take and follow step by step. It's a practice and it's a process. And given time and opportunity, we'll figure it out. And we'll invite as many people in to do that with us as we possibly can. I had other things planned, and then as I was sitting there, I thought, I'm going to tell you what it looks like in a first grade classroom. I had a little guy this year who didn't know how to play. And in the morning when students come into my classroom, I don't have morning paperwork. There's lots of choices available, maybe blocks to build with, and math manipulatives, puzzles, lots of puzzles. Our kids don't come knowing how to do puzzles. It's just not, it's kind of new to them. But everything I put out is designed to have to socially interact and to have to solve problems and conflicts. And so I noticed this one little guy, every day I would hear, no, no, and he just would scream during anything he was doing. It didn't matter who he was playing with. And then the kids would get upset with him and say they didn't want to play, and he'd run off to a corner and dissolve into a puddle and cry. And it became that I was spending a lot of time interjecting. And so it was November, and we had been doing circles every day. Restorative circles is part of our daily operation within our school. We sit, everybody's in the circle, we teach a lot of skills, we get to know each other. So we had built community. And we went to circle that morning, and I said, guys, what do you think we can do? And these are 6-year-olds. And somebody said, well, we need to have a circle about this. We need to talk about it. And so we talked, and somebody asked a question of this little guy, and they said, why don't you know how to play? And he said, well, I don't have brothers and sisters. I only play by myself, and I get to have all the toys. And you guys keep wanting to have my toys. I want what you have. And it came down to, I don't know how to play. And the other kid said, well, we can teach you how to play. Somebody said, I have 10 brothers and sisters, and I never get to touch anything. And so it just turned into this great conversation of, I don't know how, and he was able to share that. I don't know how to play. And the other kids were able to give him ideas. And I started to watch the morning play. And every now and then he'd yell no, and somebody would start to get mad and say, I don't want to play with you. And somebody else one day I heard him say, wait, remember, he doesn't know how to play. We have to help him learn how to play. So let him stay, and we can show him. And then they would work it out. I stopped having to do anything. They did it. And all year, these 6-year-olds do this over. They'll come in from recess and say, we need to have a circle. And then they'll sit and process. And it's pretty, towards the end, didn't even have to run circles. I could say, oh, you're going to run circle this morning. They would pick the question. They would even monitor each other's behavior and say, remember, everybody listens respectfully. They start to mirror our language. That's what restorative practice is for me in my classroom. That's what I see is the building of relationships and then giving kids skills that they will take out into the world the rest of their lives. It's not about how many times, I don't send somebody to take a break, or it's how are you going to solve this? How are you going to go out and be a contributing member of society? How are you going to solve your problems in your home and on the street? And it's giving them a new skill set. And I just feel really lucky to be in a place that values kids enough that we're willing to do this work and not look at it as a program and is it something we'll start and stop at a certain point. It's, you're just giving us time to figure it out, and that's really positive. Thank you.
As Ellen's talking, I'm thinking about my own experience. I've been at Montello as long as Jamie has, and I started as a special educator and then an ELL teacher and a coach, and now I'm an assistant principal. So I've successfully finished 1 year. I'm still alive, so I'm excited about that piece. But one of the things I remembered, I didn't remember until you started talking, is like when I moved into this role, I was thinking like, okay, like I know how to build relationships and community as like a teacher. Like I still had my teacher hat on, but like, how do you hold kids accountable? How do you like get kids to do what you want? Like I was really kind of freaked out about that part because it was stepping into a new role and I thought it had to be different. But what I've learned through this restorative practices piece is it's just integrated. There's nothing special about it or unique. It's really about being intentional about your relationships with other people. So when I'm encountering a student, like in Ellen's class, that same student, when she calls the office, it was really about her and I meeting at the door, talking about what's going on. She gives me the information like, hey, this kid is really struggling with this. This might be why. Maybe you guys could go for a walk and talk about this, or maybe he just needs some time and space away. So first of all, it's about her and I connecting with each other as staff people and communicating about what the child might need in that moment. Giving the kid a voice and time to talk about what might be happening, and doing that in a way that is thoughtful, where the kid doesn't feel like they are being punished. And there might still be consequences later depending on the behavior. Like maybe that student still ends up in ISS if they're not being safe, but it's about the approach. And do I harm that relationship between the student and I, or the teacher and I, if I approach it in a really punitive, sort of heavy-handed way? And that's just not my approach. I've never been that kind of person. I'm a bit more soft-spoken, and I smile too much, I think. So I don't have like that sort of powerful personality, so I was worried about how that might affect my ability to do this job well. But when I think about restorative practices, like that is the heart of discipline. It's not about punishing kids or getting them to feel shame about their behavior. It's about changing the behavior. So when we can approach it in a way that that relationship still exists and that kid can still smile at me and be excited to see me and Ellen at the end of the day, I mean, I feel like that's what success looks like.
Can you just maybe, to be clear, also talk about when those things happen in unison with some type of consequence and what's going on with the student within the context of the consequence, particularly like an in-school suspension?
So like what happens when they're there? So oftentimes we'll have a situation where, that student might come talk with me. We, have a conversation about that. And oftentimes I ask students, if they're old enough, what do you think should happen next? Or, and a lot of times students will come to the conclusion that like, I don't think I should be back with my classmates, or I'm not ready, or, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes that's a consequence I might administer is like, okay, well, that's an in-school suspension. But when that student goes to in-school suspension, one of the things we try to do in that room is have the staff people do some processing with the student about their behavior. And the conversation's not done. I mean, they're really thinking about what happened, how they can make things right, and how change can happen the next day. So we really try to prepare kids for re-entering the classroom afterwards. So it's not a one and done. It's not sitting up there doing nothing. They are still engaging in academic work up there as well. But our goal is to reintegrate them back in the classroom. We want them learning, we want them growing, and they need opportunity to practice. So, I mean, kids don't always do it, and sometimes they might slip up again, and then, but it's about the problem solving. Okay, when that happens, what can our approach be? And is assigning the same consequence every time going to change that behavior? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's what I was
okay.
So I wanted to talk real quick before I have Jamie come up and just tell you about her more recent experiences. A couple of things I want you to know. Those 4 circles, if you could, that's okay, that's fine. Those are in a particular order, and you'll see that the discipline piece was the last piece. The relationship is number 1. The community comes after that, and then the voice. I think that might look different in different contexts. I think I just want to tell you what we haven't told you is what our work was for the last 3 years. So I'm going to give you a quick description of, so you understand our process, and I think it might look different in different places. I haven't done a lot of talking with Jake at the high school. I've had a couple opportunities recently to talk to James, who's the new restorative practices coordinator over there, and talk to Ryan Anderson, who's done some work across the district. And I think things may look different at different schools. Our work really began when we went down the road of restorative practices. It really came from the adults in the building and was very much administrator sort of. It was staff driven, but administrator driven as well. And I think, you know, it might look different at a different place where we want kids to have a voice, but the process didn't start with the kids having the voice. I could imagine, I don't know this for sure, that maybe at the middle school or the high school level where you have kids who want to have a voice, that maybe the process might begin differently because of that. So our process was to, I told you, I was getting a lot of hand grabbing from some people smarter than me, sent some staff out to learn about restorative practice, and some of them came back quite energized. And anytime we've got people energized, I want to nurture that and feed it. So, okay, tell me about your excitement and what can, you know, again, it's just part of a process. So it's like I'll nurture that and see where that leads us and how many other people attach to that. And that got to a point where we decided we want to learn about this restorative practices a whole lot more. I've got a couple people on my administrative team who have had experiences in other districts or other schools. We can't start this alone. We don't have the knowledge base. And so what can we do? And we can't just send people out to workshops, a one and done. So we decided to write a grant. And this is one of the things we do at Montello School. Like when we're ready to test a hypothesis, we figure out how we're going to resource it. And in this case, we wrote a grant that was funded by John T. Gorman Foundation. And we met with them and we shared some of the very data that I just shared with you and said, we've got to, here's the issue. Here's what we think might help to address some of it. And we're awarded that grant. And the first year of that grant was really about bringing in 2 consultants who worked as a team. First started their work with the administrators, and then we planned out a whole year's worth of PD for our staff. So you got to start somewhere. So we did have a little bit of prescription going at that point. And it was really interesting because we thought we had a great plan. We had a great kickoff with our whole staff, and you know, I was pretty energized doing the kickoff. And our consultants were very different, but different personalities, and I think that's good. But they'd done this many times, so they had sort of like, here's how we're going to do it. And after we had our first couple sessions with them, we solicited feedback from our staff. And when we solicit feedback, we get it. And so we got a lot of feedback that said, this was working really well for me, but maybe this setting with all of us in the cafeteria doesn't work for me, or I don't feel comfortable working with people outside of my team, or I'm uncomfortable in a large group. So then we bring back, so our consultants would come do another planning session with the restorative practices team, and we would look at that feedback and we'd say, what changes can we make for next month? So we had, in our first year, we had something happening every single month, and it was primarily staff, and none of it was about discipline. It was all about relationships, and it started with the teacher to teach, or the staff to staff relationships, and then it was about community. And that's really where we spent our first year. And I will say that even people who do this for a living, the restorative practices thing, sometimes they're rigid. And our consultants, first couple times, we looked at feedback from our staff and said, we'd like to make a couple changes for next month. Said, that's not how we do it, Jim. We've been doing this in other schools. We said, listen, you got to listen to our staff. When they tell us this, let's respond to that. So the first couple times we had to convince took a little convincing, and we made an adjustment. And everything turned out just fine. So then, like, we were more open. So that was sort of our process. Once a month with the staff, led by our consultants, focused on relationships, focused on community, get the feedback from the staff, make whatever the little change was for next time, and do it again. And the PD consisted of learning about the use of circles, learning how to facilitate a variety of circles, including in academic settings, and setting up the day, and how a circle could be used following an event on the playground, or when something arises in the classroom that needs some kind of fix. And so that's how we spent our first year. And then we also, we were hoping to nudge, and we always want to invite, but sometimes you have to nudge, invite, and also do. So we have a third way of doing this, and what we told the staff was everyone's going to have one coaching session this year. from our consultants. And we'll start out with people that are comfortable doing that, or we had some people saying, I'd really like an individual coaching session. Great. So that's how we started. And once we had gotten through all the people who were ready for that, then we had other people who said I'd give it a try. And so everyone got a single coaching session. And those were private sessions, and they were really maybe not coaching the way you think about it. They were strengths-based, and basically the only coaching sessions I know of are the ones that staff have shared with me or the feedback they got. But every staff member had an opportunity to have a consultant in their classroom. Could have been from something from a morning meeting to a math class to accompanying them on the playground to recess. They received written feedback from the coach and an opportunity to talk about it, and it was always strengths-based. So it always started with, here's the things we're noticing about your classroom and about your practice and about your students, and then maybe here's a couple think-abouts or a couple ideas. And that seemed to work pretty well for a lot of people. And so that was our first year. In our second year, one of our consultants moved, and so we're kind of like, oh, that changes the plan. But the district had just started to work with Ryan Anderson from, I can't remember which group I can't even keep them straight, Restorative Justice Institute of Maine. And so she came to an admin meeting in the summer, and then we just invited her over to Montello, and we were fortunate to have funds for the second year of our grant. So we really utilized Ryan much more intensely than I think some other schools had opportunity to, and that's because I had grant funds to support the work she was doing. So this past school year was our second year, and where we put our focus was on the administrative team, and very little focus with their staff. In fact, Ryan had very little interaction with most of our staff. Ryan interacted primarily with me and Tiffany and Rhonda in both group sessions and individual coaching sessions, and that was something we asked for, that we need to improve our practice. I need a critical friend or a thinking partner. I need someone who can give me, like, watch what I do and talk to me straight about it. And you know, that has purpose for me, but it also has purpose because when we ask our staff to do these things, you have to model what you're asking your staff to do. And so that proved to be very valuable. I can speak to that personally. And the other thing that Ryan did was we have a number of committees at our school, and we had a PBIS committee and a restorative practices committee made up of staff, and they were saying, this doesn't make any sense because these two things aren't separate and they need to be together, and we've got to, and so that came from teachers, and we said, okay, let's rethink that. And so we spent a few months just with those two groups of teachers and Ryan really thinking about what are our practices at Montello and why do we do things, and how can we make that work more manageable, and how can we help our staff to understand the role of each of these things. And so that's work that continued throughout the school year. And then actually last week we had a retreat for 2 days, and so sometimes that outside help can help you think, can ask tough questions, and sometimes the help can work the other way, which is we ask the questions and say, can you do some research on that for me, and can you give me some ideas about that? And so that's the role that Ryan has played for us in the last year. So going into this school year, you know, our plan is to continue with the practices. The first thing we're going to be doing with our staff is really clarifying a little bit about, you know, reviewing about why we are putting these practices into place, why they're important, going back, revisiting with our staff what our belief statements are that we've all subscribed to, and how these things support our belief statements. And then we'll look to have staff supporting staff with some of that work this year. So that's, again, process. And then we have some new questions that we want to learn about, and I'm going to talk to you about those in a few minutes. So before we do that, perhaps you want to talk just briefly about your experiences in your classroom now? 10 minutes? What time is it? Oh, I'm sorry. 10 minutes. Superintendent Webster didn't give me a time frame.
I'll be quick and make it more a list then of the changes that have happened. So the feel at Montello, as we've gone through this process, more and more people at first, yes, they were like, oh, another thing, circles, but it has not just changed how I do things in my classroom, but also how we have staff meetings. It seems more like a community. Everyone's opinion is valued. So this community building piece is not just happening, it's happening in the class, but also across the building. I moved more to a responsive versus reactive, really always asking, going back to our belief statements, what is going on with the children. The children, as Ellen said, even begin to reflect and figure out each other. That part's been huge. This was my last year was my 7th year. In all of my years last year, I felt like my students, for the first time, truly were understanding each other's levels of trauma or what was going on at home. And even if they weren't friends, there was still this understanding and feel in the classroom. And we would start slow, but as it would build, we were able to just get to the academics in a deeper way. I mean, I'm a literacy teacher, so studying books in a deeper way, because the kids were able to have these conversations with each other that were on a deeper level, because everything changed about how I ran my class. Everything was in a circle, whether it was me doing a lesson in a circle or having a small circle after recess. And they knew they were going to be able to have a voice, be able to speak, be able to be asked, what was your point of view? So things just changed. It wasn't just continuously doing the reteaching, but it was asking and having them ask themselves why and what can we do better, and just always looking at it. One big piece I wanted to mention was parents. In this last school year, I know some of our ODR data would have gone down because I had students that by 6th grade had spent so much time in ISS or out of the classroom. And so I really hit it hard in the beginning of the year with their parents, and inviting them to come in and sit in a circle, even with the student present at times, and really asking the parent what's what's their point of view. And this year, many students ended the year with not being in the office, not being removed, because there was that team piece with the parents. And then just also some, as far as staff to staff relationships, some staff that in the past was closed off to change, or even to the PBIS that we had taken on. Just the way we sit and have conversations, where it's okay to disagree, it's okay to come from different spaces. Just being able to have those conversations, I feel like we've brought in people to this more philosophical change, that it's about relationships between all of us, and that we have to ask the hard questions, and it has just really given us the format to do that. So I've just seen that the relationships are key, the voice of our parents, us being heard by our administrators, and then the students knowing that their classroom is a place that they're a member of, that they can be heard, and they want to be in the classroom now. So I have seen it grow in all areas, and that's why this year I am more excited than ever to be starting my 8th year, especially after our retreat, just knowing that it's finally, we're making a difference. So I have found restorative practices extremely beneficial, not just for me, but the community and my kids.
So I will wrap it up. You saw some of our data. We should all be really pleased with some of the trajectory of that data. So we're pleased with it, but we're not satisfied with it. And I think, it's just part of a process. One of our new questions that we've started to talk about pretty intimately, and that we'll be starting to hypothesize about and explore a little bit. But I'm not sure what our starting point is going to be, is that while we've been successful at reducing those office discipline referrals, and we're suspending students less, one of the things that really sticks out in our data is that we still have a disproportionate representation of minority students in that discipline data. So that is striking when you look at the data. That is a phenomena that is not unique to Montello School. I think what it is Montello School very much is like what you hear about in the news across the country, and that requires, what we know is it's there, it's been there, the data is clear about it, and it requires some intentionality. But as most problems that present, or most things that present at Montello, we don't always know the starting point. And in this case, I'm not quite ready to jump at a prescription, but it is something that we're going to start talking about and start to explore, start to hypothesize, start to learn about, and hopefully see some positive change with that over time. But we should all be concerned about that. And so I share that with you sort of in closing, because that is something that has consumed a lot of our thought process this summer when we've had time as an administrative team to sit down, and even just thinking about what is our entry point to talk to staff about that. And I just sort of opened that up to you before I've even talked to staff about it. So that makes me a little nervous about going next week. But you know, those are things that we think a lot about, and things that require a lot of attention. Also, the attention needs to be given carefully. And so we'll wrestle with this and a few other questions throughout this school year, I'm sure. So, okay, that's all I got for you.
Thanks, Jim. We really appreciate you putting this workshop together in short notice and bringing your staff along with you. Before you head out, I'm going to open it up if there's any questions from the board, but understanding as well that this was the first part of a presentation that was put together just recently, and some of the questions might be answered in the following presentations as well. So I understand that as well. So opening it up to the board for some questions. Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Jim, and your staff for presentation. These aren't questions. For the next time, I'd really rather have information on the data on repeat offenders and escalating behaviors that we're all hearing about. When it's determined that restorative practices is not working, what training is provided to staff. We're all hearing about increased behavior, and I'm looking for more data on that. Is it really increasing? Are they just the same kids that are just escalating? And in my opinion, this is good for younger kids, but at what point do we say kids know or should know right from wrong, and we give them the consequences that our policies dictate we give them in our handbooks? Thank you.
I thought that one question that kind of follows from what Member Hutchison was just referring to. When a student does an inappropriate action, and maybe it's instigating a fight on the playground, just as an example, but maybe you can pick a better example. If I were just to look at the discipline consequence, knowing that there are a whole bunch of restorative things that you'd be doing as well, but if I just look at the discipline consequence, is the consequence different today than it was before you did restorative practices? If you understand my question.
I think I understand your question. And I always appreciate tough questions because that's what gets us thinking and hypothesizing. So, you know, if I don't have the answer or the question's tough, we kind of thrive on that. So I think, Ms. Hutchinson, you bring up a whole bunch of points that at some point I'd like to maybe respond to at some point or give some insight to, or maybe talk to you a little bit about, because they're really important ones and they're not certainly unique to you. So I think I understand the question, Superintendent West. And the first thing I would say is we showed you the data for suspensions. So that is a consequence, and it is the most significant consequence that can be applied by the principal at the school. And so the first thing I would say is you saw that even this school year, we applied that consequence. What we're doing differently is when we apply the consequence, we're making sure that we're having a significant conversation with the student, thinking about how we're going to reintegrate that student into the classroom and work needs to be done. We're talking and working with the student to help the student identify the harm that they have done or the disruption that they have caused and how that impacts their community, whether that's that classroom community or their recess community, and helping them to develop their own plan for doing it differently next time. And by the way, as you know, repeat offenders is a really important part. Sometimes they don't do better the next time, and sometimes they don't do better the third time. What I will tell you is we look at the repeat offender, and once we looked at that, that took us maybe 20 minutes to generate that information, and then we said, okay, are they the same? We received less referrals on that student, and I think that, I don't know if that answers your question, Bill, but we're paying attention to repeat offenders. We do have consequences. I think the other thing we do is we we meaning the administrators, attempt to think a little bit more individually with each student before we impose the consequence. We try to, as Tiffany pointed out, talk to the teacher and get some better background on the student and what the teacher, and listen to what the teacher has to say about the situation. And that doesn't mean that sometimes we don't just impose a consequence. I mean, we do that too, but I think we're more thoughtful about it, and we think about what are the consequences of the consequence, and what can we do. Is there something we can do in conjunction with the consequence or change the consequence that will still allow the student to develop their own sense of accountability? Because accountability isn't about me imposing it on you. It's about you coming to your own, owning it. And how can we support that process with students? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what goes through it. That's our thinking process.
Well, you've touched on part of it, but let me say something, you tell me whether this is correct or not. That for a severe behavior at school, that a suspension in the past had been called for. Is it likely that the consequence presently would also be a suspension,
Yes.
but with much different prep work?
Different prep work.
That. For example, in just one story that resonated with me, and this is something that is a relatively new change for you, you'd mentioned to me, where when a student misbehaves, instead of going right to the discussion of the misbehavior and the consequences of that, you're taking the time to better understand where is that student at, what baggage did he come to school with today, and that when you do get to that discussion, that student is much more receptive to hearing what you have to say.
Yes, and that change in my, and I can only speak for myself, that change in my practice came about from the coaching I received from having my practice observed and coached. But I have changed the order or the way in which I respond with a student. The other thing, so related to your question, you should also know that many of those suspensions in that first column for 3 years ago weren't just physical. So things that are physical tend to be things that things that are physically aggressive or physically hurtful tend to be the things that students are suspended for. But I can tell you that we had lots of students being suspended for creating disruptions in their classrooms and non-compliance with teachers. And so those were the 3 top reasons students are suspended. And 2 of those create disruptions to the learning environment. They don't necessarily create a physical danger, but they do create a disruption to the learning environment. And so that's one of the first things we ask is, what can we do to support that and change that dynamic? But much to the dismay of some people, and I think this is related to your question to Superintendent Webster, and someone asked us this earlier today, do you have a game plan for when this happens? This is the consequence. And when this happens, this is the consequence. And some people would like us to have that, and in the order that it happens. And we have not done that as a school, and that is something philosophically that I can't support, because it takes out the very nature of what we're trying to accomplish, which is understanding our students deeply and trying to change the behavior. And so that type of system leaves zero flexibility or opportunity. And so that's something that some of our staff can support and is on board with, and that is something that some of our staff don't love. And but we have the conversation, and we have it in a respectful way, and that's kind of where we're at with it.
So 2 questions, and in reference to the special ed question, maybe you could just, either you or somebody from your staff could just email us, because I'm sure if you answer it, it won't be a quick answer, so. I say that with all due respect, of course. So I really, when you said a special ed person was here, I was like, oh, well, it'd be nice to hear the role that they play through this process. And I have some assumptions what they would be, but I'd love to hear more at some point. So if somebody could share that at some point. I heard a lot tonight about making it right with the community, making it right with the offender on suspension and stuff, but I didn't hear anything about making it right for the victims of offenders. So I'm sure that's part of the discussion. So if that's a long answer, feel free to email that.
I'll email you. How's that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
The committee as a whole.
Sure.
Or through Bill, one or the other. Thank you.
Yep.
No question, just wanted to say that I was very happy to see the out-of-school suspension numbers drop quite significantly. I know all the data that I've seen have just shown that out-of-school suspensions are not only not beneficial for the student, they actually put them more behind. So as much as possible to limit those are great. I know it's not the easiest thing. So that just really stood out to me. And actually, come to think of it, I think around that you mentioned that you had hoped to be asked a question around, was it the out-of-school suspension? I might have
I don't know.
heard that.
You begged us to ask you a question.
You're very good about
My
it.
goal.
What was that
But
goal?
then I told you it was, my goal is 0.
Oh, okay.
Like I wanted to add, I couldn't wait for you to ask, so I just said it's gonna be 0. I didn't know if you'd ask it, so.
This isn't a question for you specifically, but more for Bill. What is the district doing as a whole to help move different buildings along in this process?
So, working with our grant-funded restorative practice coordinator, James Ford, and while there are some overall district objectives, it's very school-specific. I think it's fair to say, as was the case at Montello, is that the initial work on restorative practices has everything to do with relationships and nothing to do with discipline. And as the teachers pointed out, breaking through to truly develop that understanding of a student reaps so many benefits. Less discipline problems is just one aspect of it. So we're really focusing on that relationship building. And they mentioned the circles, which is increasingly being done in every Lewiston classroom. And then as schools further develop, and Montello would be the best example of it, I think, is begin to work at it from the discipline side as well.
Are we able to get the data from the other schools as far as the trends and numbers of their office referrals and such?
Yes, all this data, although did you use Swiss or is this just from Power School? Yeah, so yeah, we can get that data in all schools, and you will not see necessarily the trends that you've seen at Montello. So yeah, I think that would be good for the board. Yeah, good. Thank you for asking that.
Just makes me want to look at my own parenting skills, you know. So I opened my eyes to a different way of coming across to our children. So that's pretty great. Thank you.
Any others?
I really appreciated the data. I struggle sometimes understanding if things are working, and unless we can see things like that, it's really, I've struggled with restorative justice, not only because we don't have information that it's working, and I'm anxious to see others, but this really helped me personally, so thank you.
All right. This moment, I usually see if there's anybody in the audience who has any questions or comments. Anybody? No? Okay. So coming back to me, I had a couple of observations. Part of what I heard tonight, and as expected in a presentation like this, some of the words I heard were crying, reaching the boiling point, putting out fires, and I believe I heard this from everybody after all that was said, and that is building relationships, which you just touched upon a few minutes ago. And Jim, I've seen you over the years. I think I embarrassed you one time recently here, but I've seen that growth in your relationships at the school. And in the business world, we have what we say, a wiser man is all the wiser to surround himself with folks that are smarter than himself. And so And I know that's not always an easy task because it's always business is always evolving. Your school is always evolving, and I see that in my own business. One of the things, I think it was Ellen. Is it Ellen? Yeah. You said we all need to learn to play and build relationships. That's what we do here at the school board. Oh, geez, I thought it was funny. But I mean, it's everywhere. It's not just, what I heard is, it's not just the students. It's goes from the parent, the student, the teacher, everybody basically involved. It's that community, it's that relationship. So I appreciate how that came across. And I know there's a lot more to this that's coming, so we'll come to that. It was good to hear the questions. And just on another humorous note, one thing I did not know is that you're often called Jimmy. Yeah, you just said that. There, you had somebody tug your shoulder and called you Jimmy. Yeah. Anyway, I might use that in the future. No?
Only as close friends.
Oh, okay. Well, something might have slipped, and you didn't want anybody to know, so yeah, it happens. But again, thank you so much. Is there anything else before I? No, I don't see anything. On your way out, if Tom hasn't put it away, feel free to help yourself to the pizza we had earlier. There might be some left down there. But we certainly appreciate your time to come out here on a nice summer day to be presenting to us. We really appreciate it. All right, we're just going to take like a few minute break just so we can stretch our legs and so forth, but we'll be back in just a few minutes. Thank you. back into session, and Monique, are you ready? The technology subcommittee report. We'll move over to item number 5 to receive reports from the subcommittees and legislative liaisons. So the first one would be technology subcommittee, and Monique Roy will be the presenter.
Robust agenda today, and we got to meet Alicia Sorensen-Biggs, who is the Coding Initiative Coordinator. She gave a presentation about all of the coding initiatives across the district, talking about what's happened in summer program. This is like Montello, Longley. There's been work at the middle school. There'll be work at the high school as well. So this really is a broad-reaching program. I'm going to try to hit the highlights really quickly. So she talked about this summer, there was an introduction, second grade at Montello, introduction to block coding. At LMS, introduction to block coding with Lego robotics. And then at Longley for the 1st through 6th grade, introduction to block coding. For the school year, Longley 4th and 5th graders are going to be working with the Ozbots. That's right. Yeah, Ozbots. And then multiple buildings, 2nd through 6th grade, introduction to the block coding, code.org. And then LMS is they're going to have 2 sections of Girls Who Code Club, which is very exciting because that's a lot of girls, but it's like 40 girls, I think, altogether involved in that. And LHS is looking at introduction to computer programming courses, I think in conjunction with LRTC. And then there's some after-school initiatives as well. Longley's continuing introduction to block coding with code.org. The middle school Lego robotics. And then the high school sessions of coding related to programs over the school year. She talked about programs that talk about creating apps. With the second one, but really like kind of cool and interesting things happening with the initiative. We also talked about the website. So the plan is Friday to have the website go live. There's still some things that need to be worked on, including individual school websites. But by tomorrow, all of the principals and administrative teams have been and met with Dave Terrio about their pages and how those are going to be run and who's going to have administrative authority over them. There'll be more photos added. So all of that is a work in progress, and a lot of that's happening this week as he just gets permission from school blocks to do things. So we took a look at the sort of the beta version tonight. There will be, like, everything will be there, like the Power School portal and all of those things for resources for parents, community members, teachers, students. And then the tech team is going to work together with buildings to have control over the permissions. So not everybody can just load things on there. There's a process for it. We talked a little bit about the Power School portal because there were some questions about accessibility to that. There's a message if you go to Power School right now that says that there won't be accessibility until October. The training for teachers this week and next week. The idea is to have the grade book updated every 2 weeks so that when parents go, they have something new to look at. They can track the progress. But while that is getting up and loaded and ready, parents won't have access really till October. There's been a couple of issues as far as getting computers in time for the school year to start. The teachers at Longley should be getting their computers any day now. But the Chromebooks for the high school, with the way he discussed the RFP process and how it can't start because of the way the budgeting goes until July. So we're going to look at that process. We're going to talk with Bobby to see if, do we really have to wait till July? If it's been approved in the budget in March, can we start asking and putting that RFP out for those things so that when the funding comes for July, then we can move on contracts instead of waiting for this late date.
The vendor wasn't prepared for the amount of computer orders that they had, so we're a little bit behind schedule. They'll be in sometime in September, and so he's working to make sure teachers know to plan accordingly for that. He did say that new positions have already made a big difference, though. So the halftime secretary and the tech, and the way that they reorganize the positions have really, really made a difference for the employees to be able to be not as stressed, but to also get a lot more done. And then we talked a little bit about, and this will be an ongoing conversation, concerns about devices aging out, specifically those that are only working on Windows 7 and will not load Windows 10. So there's a lot of old devices, and they're just not going to operate to the systems that we need them to. And so talking more about that cycle of replenishment. I think that's it. Bill, did I miss anything? The coding initiative?
There's just one other thing that I'd mention. Alicia has only been with us for a month and has already done a great deal, but she's also going to be meeting with the STEM teachers in each elementary schools, and so every school will be benefiting from some of this work, as well as she's meeting with the gifted and talented teachers, which also impacts all the K-6 schools.
So yeah, I would say the coding and grant, I guess, was a great find and already being put into great implementation, and it'd be great to see how it works out towards the end of the year. We'll have another report, I'm sure, on that. And also I touched base with at the meeting, and one of the things is not that we're not the only ones that ordered computers. There's a lot of school districts that have discovered that these new Chromebooks or Lenovo's or whatever they are just so much significantly less expensive that if we might have ordered 400, but add that up with all the other districts around the country, the manufacturer just was not prepared. So that was the other thing that was brought up. But Dave always does a good job as well for preparations, and I'm sure we'll hear from him again too in the fall as well, in October. So thank you for that report. Were there any other questions from the board in regards to that? No? Okay. Next we'll go over to item B, Administrative Subcommittee. The school committee member Luke Johnson will present.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We had a pretty simple agenda, which is really nice today. I guess first big thing that we talked about was grant accounts, essentially accounts that have like remaining funds in them, just like very small bits. And you can either kind of keep those, carry them over. It really depends on the amount. I know Bobby can certainly interject if she wants to add anything. But we really talked about, I guess, what to do with those funds. And like a standard practice may be to move those over to the general fund if it's a small amount. We will try and find out like the grantor and see how they want the rest of the money to be spent. Let's see. Yeah, like, and we'll also take a look at those and see if we can find a way to spend it in the way that the grant was kind of for. And if not, we can always transfer it to the general fund, something like that. We follow every contract that we agree to. And I know something we were talking about was a threshold of maybe $500, and possibly even developing a policy as a committee, where maybe it could be something along the lines of, anything under 500 is just more discretion for chief administrative officer, and then anything over maybe 500 would come to the board so that we'd at least be aware of it. So, going forward, I think later this year, we will be discussing fiscal management policy, so that's something that could play into that, and we'll definitely keep it on our mind as that comes up. Let's see, regarding that, I think that was just about it. Also, we just discussed in general the policy review process, what the schedule is, the plan going forward, kind of what to expect in the next coming months. And so something in particular, looking at maybe adding something related to facilities development in the policy, updating the tobacco policy, possibly addressing vaping in there as well. And then, of course, the updated field trip policy, which is in the plan. So just kind of being prepared for what's coming ahead. And lastly, we also talked about determining the official charge for the subcommittee, since we didn't quite have one and want to know kind of going forward what we should kind of dig into and what we shouldn't. So really just those three things. Also, we had Monique Gilbert recently on board attend the meeting as well. It's fantastic, and we're very happy to have her with us. And that was our meeting. Bobby, can you think of anything to add? Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. And now item C, Teaching and Learning Subcommittee. School Committee member Tina Hutchinson will present.
Okay, so our agenda kind of gets set by everybody else lately for some reason or another. We heard a presentation today that the conversion of the freshman grades went very well, but there was a little bit of anomaly around the summer school conversion that they're still working on. Standards are going to continue to exist and have been reviewed. The plan is to get the standards on a 5-year cycle, content level, grade level, etc. going forward. Everybody has heard that LD 1666 passed the legislature and the governor signed it into law, so we've been charged with looking at making a recommendation to this board on how we go forward. And to do that, we're going to have some public forums, and they will be announced as public meetings so that all school committee members can attend. So mark down October 18th. We've changed the time. Instead of 1 to 3, it's going to be 3 to 5 and 6 to 8. Those will be at LMS. And our teaching ones will be on November 1st from 2:30 to 3:30 and 3:30 to 4:30 at LMS. We will be meeting again in September to discuss our purpose for these forums and what we're looking to get out of them. And we will be discussing the first 11 of 56 policies that we were told have to be done this year. Good luck getting those out of us anytime soon. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Hutchinson. And next we'll go to item D. School Committee member Monique Roy and Mark Kerr will present.
We have a meeting Wednesday with Nate Libby and other people attending? Or is it just Nate? To get a conversation going about how we can have a regularly calendared meeting with our local representatives.
We recently met with Bill, Bobby. Yeah.
All set? Okay, thank you. Her city council representative is not here. Did you have anything from her? I don't know, sometimes she'll tell me stuff, so I haven't heard from her. So we'll move over and go straight to item number 7, report from the school chair. So next Monday, we have a personnel meeting at 6 p.m. It's scheduled for 6 p.m. We'll begin with a workshop on school climate and staff retention, followed by the personnel agenda, and after that I'm expected to add the public announcement of a report on hiring the consultant to assist in the hiring of superintendent. Add to that.
And you and I haven't had a chance to fully talk about that, but the tentative agenda, and you'll talk further with Bobby when you meet with her tomorrow morning, would be that after the consent agenda, there'll be an executive session, which the board could choose to use as it deems fit on the superintendent search process, and then the action after it, if the possible vote, if that's what the committee does on what consultant to hire.
Yes, that. And also, I often meet with you individually, but I also wanted to share here at this meeting, basically to thank all of you for all the commitment, dedication, and the sacrifice you put forward in being involved and representing your district or your ward, your city, your school district. I'm very honored to all work with you, and I'm very proud of what you do to represent. And it's really interesting after tonight's workshop, the relationships you build and how you communicate and build that really restores and reflects what we do to our community. So I thought that was very good, and I just wanted to say thank you. We'll move forward to item number 8, a report from the school superintendent, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I've got a number of things that I'm just going to touch on, but I'm more than happy to answer questions, or if any of you want to follow up with email, that's fine. A lot of work this summer on the new school construction project, as well as I've taken a little piece, and Bobby's taken a much larger piece on the facilities work that remained after the departure of our last facilities director. Among the things that I've worked on is we are going to the planning board on Monday to see at the Geiger Elementary School being given permission to use the present fire lane for buses only. And if we're able to do that, we're going to go a long way to addressing some of the congestion issues, so buses will not need to enter from College Street. I've also been working with Principal Langley's on the parking layout at the high school, and we're close to finalizing, at least temporarily, if not permanently, how we're going to address the special ed drop-off. So there's information will be forthcoming on that very soon, certainly before the end of the beginning of the school year. Our school training is going to be significant this week. We've already had a couple of sessions, and we've got a couple days this week. We'll be focused primarily on the high school level. One thing that I wanted to mention, and Sean can confirm the exact date, but the parent portal will be operational sometime early October. Is that correct? October 8th. And part of that is we've got a lot of work to do with staff. We don't want parents to get on and not see any information. So our expectation is it still every 2 weeks we're expecting a teacher district-wide to add something into that portal that will be helpful to parents in gauging the progress of their sons and daughters. We've had a number of discussions with the LAA this summer on various issues, one of which was rolling out the part-time release that is in the contract that the school committee approved. And I'm pleased, and the negotiating team knows this, as does Bobby, that the LEA, Sammy Garnett for her every other day when she is released from teaching duties. Her office location will be here in Dingley. She's going to be in the little Dingley room, as we call it, which is downstairs opposite my conference room. So there was some initial hesitancy on that, and I was real pleased that we were able to work that out, because I think part of the success of that process will be the informal contacts we'll be able to have with her in this building. Some of the things that happened this summer, actually going back to construction, I didn't talk about the new school. The school project itself is, I think, going very well. PC Construction is an excellent builder. The building is on schedule. We have incorporated some of the security enhancements that we had hoped for based on an informal TRC review of the new building plans. We've had some challenges with the new fields, and I have not been entirely happy with how that has gone, and I've voiced my concerns to our architects. And these things are being addressed, but just to give you an idea of some of the behind-the-scenes stuff that superintendents get involved with. The press box was designed 3 feet too high. And you might think that that was an easy fix. Well, we should have demolished the whole thing and started over again, but we've done everything from had to redo the stairs, which delayed the project, to now the windows being too high so you don't see the whole field. So we're going to stools instead of chairs. I mean, it's been one thing after another. The infield area on one end of the track to accommodate the high jump area was paved. That's what the plan said, but it should have been in that same rubberized track. You can't do high jump on pavement. We've had some problems with drainage. The paving was designed for sidewalk, which is 2 inches thick, but we need to drive emergency vehicles up from Birch Avenue, whether it be an ambulance or fire truck or a snowplow. And so that's had to be changed to 3 inches thick, and there's more to it than that, but that's it in essence. But those are the types of concerns and frustrations that we've had on that project. Yes. Yeah. So one of the challenges, this is a state-funded project, and had these things all been in the design to begin with, they would have been covered by the costs, and the state would not have raised any questions, because the total bid still came in millions less than what the budget was. But now, that's all behind us, and we're starting anew, and so everything that comes up, it's a fight in terms of whether the state's going to cover it or whether it's going to be something covered by the architect. So we've gotten through each of these, and Harriman has agreed to cover some of it, and at this point the state has agreed to cover the things, particularly the additional paving costs, for example. There would have been additional cost had it been designed appropriately from the beginning. So far so good, but there are all struggles. All struggles. Yes. So I've probably in my career done 9 or 10 projects, of which 3 were brand new schools, and so I'm more limited than someone who's done hundreds, but this usually it's been things where the builder hasn't quite done it to the way it was intended to be designed. This is the highest number of things that weren't designed right to begin with. So they're all, they're all being rectified, but in my experience, it has been a higher number than I would have expected, and more significant. I mean, in the case of my numbers may be wrong, but I think they're correct. In the case of the track area, it's like $180,000. The paving was $45,000. So these are not inconsequential numbers. I think when all is said and done, the 3 feet press box era is probably going to approach $50,000. I mean, you wouldn't think that, but these things mount up. Also this summer, my office, and I thank Sue Turgeon for her work on this, we've done a lot of school choice decisions. We're pleased they're able to honor most, but not all. They come down to classroom enrollment sizes, and so we've had to reject some. But by and large, people have been accepted. Our preschool enrollment numbers have been, I think at this time, a little stronger than last year. Geiger is full, McMahon is full, Farwell is full already, and there's still more that would like to be there. One of the things I do as superintendent I've had read and written evaluations on all of my direct reports, so that's something that takes up a lot of my time in August. Some of the fun things I've had, I'm looking forward to this. My wife and I went to a concert at I don't know if any of you have been to the little Robin Hood Meeting House in Georgetown. It has a second floor, which was an old style meeting house. It kind of looks like a church. We heard a string quartet play there who focus on visiting schools across the country. And to make a long story short, they're going to come to Lewiston. I've got a grant that's going to fund their participation, and we're still working out the details, but we intend to invite and provide busing for every student involved in strings K-12 or 312, I guess is when it starts, and there'll also be a student concert at the middle school, so I'm excited about that. A lot of work in preparing for the new school year. Last week we had a 2-day ad team retreat, which covered a number of topics. One of the things that I did want to make the board aware of is that, and this in part reflective of the Department of Justice review that you know a little bit about, and they're concerned about disparity by race in some of our policies and practices. The ad team read 2 books this summer on race, one by the perspective of a white female and one by the perspective of a black female. And that was part of our discussion at the retreat. And our goal this year is to give administrators more tools to be able to talk about race, because it's an undercurrent in Lewiston for sure. And we are increasingly having students that feel rightly or wrongly that certain actions on the part of staff are because of race. And so we need to better support our staff in that regard. And related to that is we're doing more work on understanding cultural differences, which leads to some of the misunderstandings that were referred to tonight. And that also ties into the restorative practices, which we'll talk about more next month. Another thing I want to mention, we've had 2 Regional Service Center Board of Directors meetings that Tina, as designated board member for Lewiston, has attended. I think that we're as far, if not further along, than any other regional service center in Maine. And while we haven't made any definitive decisions, we are moving forward in 3 areas to spend, our hope is to spend most, if not all, of the $97,200 received from the state. That's money that's went directly to the service centers. And one of the things we're looking at and getting more information on is using those funds to purchase the substitute software that's already used in Auburn and Lewiston, and could potentially be used in RSU 16 Poland and SAD 52, which is Turner. And if we do that, the cost would be reimbursed to Lewiston, and I can't, was it 16,000, Bobby, what we spent on that? So that would be nice to have happen. Another area we're looking at is we used to have a weather contract with a meteorologist. Now only Auburn does, but we share that information with each other, is to have the Regional Service Center pick up that weather contract. It's not a large amount of money, $500 or $1,000, something like that. And then the third area, which I think that we're all pretty excited about, because this ties right into the TRC work, kind of the next step. So, you know, we're getting these security assessments from all our buildings, but then what do we do with it? What is the training that goes with it? What changes should we make to our emergency plans? And there's a consultant that is servicing Auburn now that is doing some of the very things that we want to do as a district. And so we're getting more information and seeing if perhaps the Regional Service Center could fund this security consultant to work with all 4 districts. Bobby, is there anything else that on that I might mention, or Tina, anything you'd like to mention?
Just to clarify, some of this consultant is actually doing trainings with staff on how to react or not react to certain situations. For example, when a fire drill is told, not just running out of your classroom as fast as you can, but waiting and listening to see if there are other directions coming. So this consultant does some of the trainings that would benefit our staff, and was recommended in that report we got at the high school. So it would move us along without costing the district itself some money.
The last thing that I wanted to mention is that we completed the Teacher Diversity Initiative this year, and I've got a meeting tomorrow on that. But we had 15 students participate in that, all of whom are substitute teachers for Lewiston. So that was real nice to think that we're providing a program that may be the stepping stone for more than one of them to actually ultimately be a teacher for us in Lewiston Public Schools. That's it, unless there's a question.
Thank you for that very thorough report. Appreciate it. Just a fun fact just happened today. As many of you know, I preserve a lot of old films and videos, and I was checking a tape, and we can't transfer anything that's copywritten, but it was one VHS tape that had over 3 hours of footage from news sources and whatnot on when President Bush Sr. visited Lewiston. He visited Farwell School and he visited the high school back in 2000. What caught my attention even more so was that the superintendent of the time was Connors, and I had never seen him or seen a picture, so it was interesting to see that. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So moving ahead, sorry. Would you like to add to that?
So I am teaching another candy making class on October 18th from 6 to 9. Contact Adult Ed if you'd like to learn how to make candy canes or saltwater taffy.
I think we should all sign up. All right, moving ahead to item number 9, future agenda items. Are there any future agenda items that folks would like to bring up? All right, seeing none, we'll move forward. Item number 10, to enter into executive session to discuss a personal matter in accordance with 1 MRSA 405, paragraph 6A. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Okay, we have a motion by Ms. Hutchinson, a second by Mr. Jensen. Those in favor? It is unanimous. We will go into executive session. 9:05.